Hello and welcome to Validator Roadmap. My name is Kevin and I run a company called Throwback Labs. We're a small crypto infrastructure provider attempting to validate on Solana. The goal of this podcast is to illuminate the process of establishing a validator on Solana through our firsthand experience. The journey is broken into 3 parts: before, during, and after. Last time we discussed the bee's nest of thoughts we held before setting up our validator. I brought in some if you'll allow, beekeepers, to help me sort through them. Folks from the Solana Foundation, other validators, and entrepreneurs to have an honest conversation about who is best suited to validate sustainably on Solana and what it takes to do so. But these were just our expectations. Today's episode finds us sloshing around in the belly of deployment, digesting and burping our way through an Ubuntu server and eventually joining the active validator set. Hopefully, the episode feels more like a Tums. By its nature, this will be a more technical episode. We'll get specific on topics like Solana's server program, RPCs, Solana's account structure, baselines, common errors, and more. As a creator, this episode was the one I was most worried about, both being vulnerable about my own technical knowledge as well as attempting to make something listenable. I don't want you, dear listener, to feel like Jinsu Kwan in Season 2 of Lost, stranded on the proverbial beach of this podcast while strange-sounding gibberish flies meaninglessly overhead. Or worse, just, really bored. So I've done 2 things. First, I've published step-by-step GitHub documentation showing how to set up a Solana validator and an accompanying YouTube video tutorial that walks through it. Those are linked in the show notes. That way, we can keep this episode a little more jazz and a little less classical. No disrespect to Brahms or Ravel. To keep me on track, I wanted to start with a focus on what I feel is the red thread of this episode: troubleshooting. It's what DevOps, which for our purposes means running servers and applications, is. Things rarely work as they're written on paper, or if they do, eventually they break and we have to figure out why. Maybe I'm reaching for meaning, it's something I'm known to do, but this process of problem solving, this continuous vaulting of obstacles, it's a pretty universal base state. For some perspective on that and a quick detour, we love quick detours on this podcast, I brought in my friend Garret Koehler, an entrepreneur who founded Assemble Sound. For the unawares, Assemble Sound is self-described as a music company based in Detroit. They have a sprawling physical campus there, as well as a recently signed joint venture with Atlantic Records.
For us, and I think in general, part of our journeys as entrepreneurs and as people are just finding these kernels of what feels like success along a journey that is going to be riddled by failure. And I think that in the same way, it's about finding these sort of moments of clarity in a journey that's really defined by the unknown. So for us, again, I think in that first year, every month, I was like, I don't know how we're going to pay our mortgage. I don't know how we're going to pay these bills, let alone how we're going to eat as business partners, as people working on it. And you've got to push. You have to be able to experience that instability and that unknown, and also experience the clarity and the success of. But we got everyone in a room together, and they're excited to make music, and that was the goal. Or I can hear the song that's being made upstairs, and I can't believe that song is coming out of that person, or those 2 people are in a room together. In a year, that could be something totally magical that makes us money in a way we never expect, or could even envision right now. And I think that I don't know, that's why the journey maybe is really difficult for some people, is because you can't hold both of those truths simultaneously, that there is a great amount of unknown, but also a lot of clarity. There's a great amount of failure and simultaneously a lot of success. And if you can't see both of those things together, just surviving on the journey. It seems impossible to me. I think we realized that the way to combat that was actually like just try to create more access to information along the way for all participants. And doing so breeds a greater sense of trust, even if that information might be like, hey, like it's really hard to be successful in this field in the way that, you might be thinking about success right now, as opposed to sort of everyone could make it, like we're all in this together and we're all going to end up at the same place. Like in the short term, that might create this false sense of trust. But as soon as someone realizes that's not actually the reality, it undermines all of the trust that's been created amidst the participants.
And even to that, like in the last 6 months, I've learned a lot. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, in addition to, like, here's how you do this, here's what it's really like, is like get a solid understanding of what my philosophy is on the end game of this particular component of the crypto industry. And for a while, I thought it was like, oh man, there's going to be this really cool, robust ecosystem of thousands or tens of thousands of people running infrastructure and paying their bills running infrastructure. And I think that's probably not the case. The case is probably there's a couple hundred, maybe. And then the rest of the folks, like there's money to be made, but it's not, pay your rent forever kind of money. It's like side hustle money, right? And it's like you can develop a very useful set of skills that you can optimize over time to take up a small amount of your time and generate some side hustle income that you can really, really count on. But if you really want to bank those skills, you're going to have to explore a bunch of different options and opportunities that are probably going to become available to you and can become available to you because of this knowledge you've learned and this side hustle you have. But it's, if your end all be all is to do this and only this, it's not that you can't do it. And I think that there will be opportunities for a very long time for people to do it. But the hill is significantly higher than like, okay, now I know how to run a Linux server and therefore I can do this full time on my own terms.
It's so crazy because,
Are we getting to the everything is everything portion of the conversation?
Everything is everything. Like literally, if I just was listening to what you were just talking about with no context, I would have assumed you were talking about the artist development journey in music, right? Like because I can't tell you almost every person that I've worked with who maybe once considered themselves an artist, came into the Assemble Sound space, maybe started producing, then started writing with other people as a producer, and then realized like, oh, I actually just like the craft of putting a song together and would rather do it for commercial clients. So you have artists who come in thinking they're going to be, world touring on stage wearing, costumes, and walk out going, I can't wait to have a career as a composer in the film and TV space. So these definitions of success for the participants can and have to evolve over time. But if you have these very narrow versions of what success looks like as an outcome, you sort of are blinded by all of the other things that not only could be defined as successful, but mostly will just like make you happy.
All right. Zooming back in from the everything is everything part of our programming, something that has always made me feel comfortable when learning something new is getting a sense for the set of skills required and the general time it takes to acquire them. Unfortunately, there's usually not a one-size-fits-all, but I still think it's valuable to try, caveats and disclaimers withstanding. From a time standpoint, for me personally, I can break it down as follows. It takes me about 40 minutes to do a full validator deployment using the GitHub documentation I mentioned earlier. It took us about 2 weeks of testing and mucking around to get a basic idea of the Solana command line. That's the built-in set of commands the Solana program has to interact with the blockchain, as well as how to troubleshoot common problems. And out one step further, for me, it's been about 6 months of consistent, validator-focused DevOps work to get me where I am today. Now, in 6 months, you cannot get comprehensive or even truly comfortable, especially if, like me, you were previously, using air quotes, non-technical. But you can spend around 200 hours studying Linux server administration, basic networking, and because of Solana, an extra 20 to 30 hyper-focused hours on hardware and partitioning. To start, I wanted to play a clip from my initial conversation with the folks at Inflect. Inflect is Solana's server program concierge. They help folks like me connect with data centers and secure the bare metal resources needed to run a Solana validator. I'm not sure why, but I had a lot of anxiety around working with bare metal infrastructure, using cloud infrastructure. So that's Amazon Web Services, DigitalOcean. They're all very user friendly. My expectation of using a data center was something along the lines of trying to buy a guitar rig from Guitar Center and knowing very little about playing guitar. I was definitely intimidated. So this is Megan Lund from Inflect. She walked us through onboarding.
So what we do is we hand you off to the provider. You get set up in their portal. They give you the access to spin up your server remotely through the portal. And then everything is configured through your portal with the help of the team that you're working with. So Equinix, Lumen, whomever you decide to go forward with. They help you with all of that stuff.
And what would happen if we changed our minds?
It's very easy to spin back up, add another server, add a different provider, anything like that. It's all done through us in the same way. So if you were to decide 6 months later you want to spin up again, but you have one Lumen machine, you want to add an EQ2, and you want to have them in a totally different location, you would just reach out to me. I would send you all of the information for onboarding with Equinix. You would create your portal, and then in 2 days, you would have your machine or less. So,
well, you've made it sound a lot less scary than I think I maybe thought that it was going to be going into this. I didn't know how human this process was going to be. I was thinking that I would go down like a rabbit hole of form filling out, and then having to have like a pretty detailed knowledge of specs and kind of remote networking and all of these different things. So this feels good. I feel pretty confident in our ability to do this, and it not being like some knowledge gap that we're missing.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing here, because it's like learning a different language. It's not only new to you right now or me right now, but to the world kind of relatively, So so that's what we just want to make sure that this is like an approachable process and that you can get set up and not feel like you're just completely overwhelmed with information that you have no idea how to interpret. So that's perfect. Well, I'm glad that you feel supported and
she was right. Setup was super easy. We got in touch with Lumen, the data center we ultimately decided to go with. And after creating an account with a master username and password, we SSH'd into the server with no issues. We chose our data center location based on a recommendation from Megan about areas that were underrepresented in the network. Choosing to locate in less concentrated data centers is good for the health of the network because it makes the overall Solana network less vulnerable to things like equipment failure as well as local power and internet outages. With our server secured, it was time to deploy. Now, to keep this podcast moving, I'm not going to walk through all of Solana Validator operation. As mentioned, I've left the step-by-step to the GitHub documentation and the YouTube walkthrough linked in the show notes. Check that out, seriously. What I want to use the rest of this episode for is context I wish I had, and thereby a discussion of key validator components. So, before we get started, let's take a deep breath together. There's going to be a lot of vocab in the next section, but don't get discouraged if it doesn't click right away. It certainly didn't for me. The point here is to distill as much as possible and give you an idea of where to start your own research. As such, we're going to do a lot of zooming out and then zooming back in. In my own brain, I organize the components of Solana Validator operation into two distinct camps, architecture and performance, each of those with a couple subgroups. Now, to be clear, this is just my mental model, but it has helped me better process how all this stuff works. So camp 1, architecture. There's 3 key things you need to go deep on here. First, your server. This is your actual physical machine, the one we secured through Lumen. Enmeshed in this is understanding you'll need to gain about the best way for your machine to read and write the data a validator needs. This means storage, disk partitioning, RAM, and how to optimize them all for Solana. All right, we're going to zoom from 30,000 feet to about sea level for an excerpt of a conversation I had with Michael, who runs the validator Laine, which is one of the larger validators on Solana. I met Michael through Discord. He was extremely helpful as we were getting started and asking questions to the community. This conversation came about during a time when the Solana testnet had gone down. We were discussing troubleshooting, and he ended up giving a really enlightening explanation of how Solana chain data makes its way into your validator, what your validator is actually doing, and how this is related to your machine's storage.
Right, yeah. So on a high level, the data that a validator consumes and produces and works with is broken down into the ledger, which when you don't specify the others, the ledger directory holds everything. But primarily the ledger directory contains a RPC endpoint, a file called admin.rpc, which is how you connect to the validator. And it contains a directory called rocksdb, which is basically the working database of transactions that the validator works with. Then you have accounts, snapshots, and the tower. So the accounts is, as it says, basically all the accounts. So your wallet address, any contract on Solana, any public key is an account. And an account can just hold a balance in LAMP ports, or it can contain executable data, so a smart contract essentially. It can belong to a parent program like the SPL token program, meaning it's a token account. So that's basically your accounts, right? And which you could think of similar to bank accounts in a way. And then you have the snapshots directory, which is basically your validator constantly produces snapshots as it's running. And it's just a way for it to kind of put a marker at a point in time and say that, this is what everything looked like at this point in time. So if it were to crash, it could reload its own snapshot and you wouldn't have to download one. Or if your RPC was open, you could serve snapshots to other providers if you wanted to. So you're constantly producing snapshots. That's what the snapshot directory is. And then you have the tower. And the tower is basically just a record of all your votes as a validator. So those are all things you can break out into separate directories on your hard drives. And the main consideration, the tower is something most people don't really look at, and it's maybe not that important. But the main thing that people look at when operating validators is that you put your accounts sometimes in a RAM disk, because the thinking is that there's a lot of writing to and from accounts. So you want to improve the speed with which you do that, and you want to reduce the wear and tear on your SSDs from that constant writing and reading, because accounts change all the time, every slot almost.
Right.
Depending on the account, of course. Snapshots also have a lot of writing and reading because you're basically constantly writing like gigabytes of data. So some people have even tried putting snapshots into a RAM disk. That's something else that you could do.
I needed the concept of snapshots explained one more time, and Michael was kind enough to oblige.
Yeah, so when you load from a snapshot, basically your accounts directory is immediately the full size that it should be at that point in time for any other validator.
Right.
And it also indexes all of those accounts. Your rocksdb will start out at 0, and then it will increase over time until it reaches whatever configured value you've set, and then kind of hover at that point.
Second, Linux administration. This is the part where you're actually punching in commands to your operating system to make the validator software run. I'm going to gloss over this bit, mostly because the actual commands to run a Solana validator on a Linux OS are pretty well documented. That said, remember those 200 plus hours I mentioned earlier? This is where they came in handy. Last in my subgrouping of architecture is validator accounts. This is the group of accounts, wallet addresses, pub keys, lots of different words in crypto that mean the same thing, that you will need to create to run a validator and how they interact with each other. So here's me trying to explain validator accounts to Derek, one of my partners at Throwback Labs. So right now I'm going to try and explain to you the Solana account structure. Okay. So it definitely took me a little while. I think I've pretty much got it. It's one of those things where it's like, you read it and you're like, what? And because any other chain that we've operated on, you have your wallet address where you have money, and then you have your like validator address, and that's normally the maximum amount of addresses you have, and sometimes they're one and the same. I understand why they do the stuff the way that they do it, but the fact that there is so much sending and receiving can kind of obscure what is doing what and what is going where. So there are I think about it in two different trees, right? So there is the validator account structure, which consists basically of three main accounts. You have your authorized withdrawer account, which name sort of explains it. You have your validator identity account, and you have your vote account. And so the vote account votes. It is also the account that gets the stake delegated to it. It's where you accrue rewards on stake delegated to your validator. Mm-hmm. The identity account is your validator identity. It's the thing that pays the transactions. So your vote account is not paying for any of the transactions. It's the account that you'll give somebody. Like if you wanted to delegate to me, I would send you my vote account address. The identity account is paying all the transaction fees. So the vote fee transaction, like to actually submit that, and then the transactions with updating, posting to the chain. Mm-hmm. The authorized withdrawer is basically the end all be all. If you want to change the address of your vote account, if you want to change the address of your validator identity, or if you want to withdraw funds from your vote account, that's the account that does it. So it's those three accounts on that side. The other tree of accounts you just heard me mention are for staking, which are actually not a part of validator operation, so I'll spare you my breakdown. Just know that it's what you would use if you wanted to use your own coins and earn rewards from staking them to your validator. Okay, so that's how I bucket architecture. You've got your physical server and how you administer things like storage and RAM. You've got Linux admin, or the actual operation of the software, and then your validator accounts, the bank accounts, to use Michael's phrasing, that you create before you start your validator and how they relate to each other. Once again, this is just my own mental model for Solana. The actual architecture under the hood, it's an incredibly intricate machine, like a sports car. Right now, we're just focused on turning the car on and keeping up with traffic. So I know that was a lot of info, but in this moment, something Derek said during our conversation comes to mind.
But that's kind of where I am with a lot of this is you can go deep, but if you're new at this stuff, you're gonna fall behind if you go too deep into it. You're just gonna focus on all of this stuff you think you don't know and all that.
Yeah, and that's a really solid point, because that's definitely my biggest where I can trip myself up is I feel like I have to understand things first, and so I can spend... Okay, so we're going to keep moving here. So now I want to talk about my second camp, which is performance. And here I think of things in two subgroups as well. First, you've got the network. Speed is the name of the game in Solana. You need to understand the limitations of things like your processor and your network interface card, as well as the limits of whatever your internet connection is. Additionally, an understanding of the Solana P2P, that's peer-to-peer, network, and what ports need to be open to allow for communication with the blockchain. Ultimately, it all rolls back to speed. And in Solana, speed manifests as your ability to catch up with the blockchain. I spoke with Tim Garcia, head of validator relations at the Solana Foundation, about just that.
Like you mentioned, there's a little bit of game theory in there, right? Where if you sort of play this out to the end, there's going to be some high performing people that are considered low performing because, theoretically the average is moving better and better, and not everybody can be the best, right? Mm-hmm. I think in practice that's not going to be the case, just for a couple different reasons. For some highly staked validators, their infrastructure is not part of the server program, and they tend to use hardware that maybe is not the most optimized, but it's the easiest for their IT department, right? And that makes plenty of sense to them because they have other sort of security considerations or like just ease of operation within the company. So they might not be performing as highly as they could be, but for them, they don't care because it just would cost too much to be on a Solana server bare metal. Well, I shouldn't say Solana server, a server program server that's bare metal. So I think that factor will sort of make it so that there's always room to be a better performer if you really care. The other thing about skip rate that I should mention is that if your skip rate starts to, there's not a lot of sort of knobs outside of server hardware that can affect skip rate. So you might have to look into different things to try to improve your skip rate, right? You might have to look into the network layer and see like, are my transactions or are my shreds that are coming to me taking a long time because I'm in a location where the internet as a whole is not very well connected. So one thing that I found super interesting when I first started working at Solana and learning more about the network is that in the US, for example, there's about 8 or 9 places in the US where different data center providers and network providers plug into each other. And if you're not in one of those 8 or 9 areas, you're going to have a couple extra hops in order to talk to somebody on a different network. So what people do is they try to all be in that same data center so that they can have the best throughput compared to somebody who's not. So Chicago is one of them, Miami's one of them, LA is one of them, a few others. So you want to be in those areas to improve skip rate because if you're outside of those areas, you're going to have to incur an extra 100 milliseconds or so every time you try to either send data or receive data.
The second thing I think about underperformance is monitoring. Once online, you need to know if your validator is active, and if not, why, which is a little harder than it sounds. This is where community is your friend, along with tools like Prometheus, Grafana, Solana Watchtower, and any of your other favorite monitoring tools. The aim here is to get a good understanding of common errors. It takes some time, but even for throwback, I've started to see patterns in the issues that come up and the way the logs look, and thus I can fix them quicker. This is something I got from Shinobi Systems, who is actually one of the largest validators on Solana. Here's him talking about that same phenomena.
No problem. I mean, it is, but it takes time, but you will understand the logs better if you read them long enough and understand. And don't be afraid to do that, by the way. I think a lot of validators, operators don't even look at their logs. They wouldn't understand what to look for. And it's true, it's very daunting at first because it's this giant fire hose.
Yeah.
But you'll start to look, you'll notice patterns. When it's starting up, I can tell as it's starting up, just by like the shape of the logs, how they look as they're flying by, I can kind of recognize the 2 or 3 different phases of startup. And I know when it's about to be done, which helps me because if it gets to that point and then it doesn't start for another minute or 2, I'm like, hey, something's wrong. Whereas if I didn't know how to recognize that shape, I would never know when something looks like it's wrong, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So,
from there, I asked him about what he typically monitors and what his setup looks like.
I monitor almost nothing. What I monitor is from the outside, these are my validator voting. That is the only thing I monitor. If that is happening, all is good. If that is not happening, I have to address it. And so, whereas I could have a big fancy dashboard with lots of blinking lights and lots of charts, and people like to see those, and maybe some people think that, there's value there, and there probably is value there if you're watching trends and trying to anticipate when you might have a problem in the future because it looks like your memory is increasing over time or something like that. I have found over the course of a year of doing this that I have never run out of memory. I have never run out of disk. Now, of course, these things can happen. So I may be describing a situation much like before I had alerting, where I thought, okay, things are always cool and I don't have to have this thing. So maybe if you talk to me in 6 months from now, I'll say I needed to have more alerting because I missed something. That's possible. But in the last year that I've been doing this, I haven't needed any of that. Well, all I need to know is my validator voting? That is what my function of my validator is for the network. That, make those votes and the blocks.
And there's no circumstance under which you could be voting, but voting falsely, and you would trigger.
Fortunately, the way that what I'm really watching for is what's called delinquency, which I'm sure you've heard that term.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where there are lots of, parts of the Solana system that watch validators and detect when the votes that they've cast either aren't happening or are somehow flawed and aren't, being counted. And the point is there starts to be this gap between the last slot that you voted on successfully and the current slot that's valid. And once that gap grows and grows, and once it grows to a certain point, there's RPC nodes will just say you're delinquent. So all you really have to do is query RPC nodes and say, am I delinquent?
I aired this not as an advert to minimize monitoring, but more to show that even amongst the most knowledgeable, competent validators, there is an understanding that there is such a thing as too much. For me, it's a comforting notion, even if it can be hard to accept sometimes. I also wanted to take a quick second to run through a few of the mistakes I made during deployment on the off chance they save any of y'all some time. Here's me using Derek as an audience stand-in again. First, we've got not following directions. All right, so here's my mistakes. So when creating the validator identity, something that you have to do with any of the accounts that become not just normal wallets, they become the stake account or they become the vote account or the validator account. You have to run a command after you create the wallet to designate it as that thing, right? And so I forgot, and I don't know why, it's just like the way it sits in the documentation, I always scroll right past it. I forgot to do the set key pair to designate it as my validator identity. And man, I spent hours. I'm just like, what the fuck? Because the thing is, it doesn't cause a critical error. And like, nothing, it's not going to tell you it's not the kind of error that like you see like, oh yeah, I'm an idiot, I didn't do that. It's like you won't find it in
instruction.
Yes. I also tripped myself up on networking. At one point, I was allowing TCP instead of UDP on the P2P ports. Peer-to-peer communication is usually done through UDP, so keep that in mind when creating your firewall. You'll want to use UDP for the P2P ports and TCP for the others like SSH, or if you're using your validator as an RPC. And yes, I realize that's a hilarious amount of acronyms. Additionally, one time my validator identity account ran out of SOL. As a result, it couldn't pay for transactions, so my validator stopped voting. So yeah, make sure you keep that account funded. It's a pretty easy alert to set up as well. Also, an error that showed sometimes all you can do is turn it off and turn it back on. So this is an unsatisfying thing that happened to me. I can't even call it a mistake because I still don't know what happened. But and this is definitely not best practices, but we're warts and all. That's the point of this show. I was doing the tutorial yesterday. It's basically like a walkthrough of the documentation I created, video tutorial. And so I hit launch and I go look at it and I'm 22,000 blocks behind, which I learned from another validator. If you're ever more than 3,000 or 4,000 blocks behind, you're never going to catch up. That's just a fact. And so I'm like, what? Like, great. I just spent 50 minutes recording this video and it's not even working. And I restarted it. It wasn't working. I changed a couple parameters. It wasn't working. I was like, man, I'm at a loss. I did a full reboot of the machine, came back, working. And the chain wasn't down. It was, I believe, something on my end, right? Because like because I couldn't catch up. So I don't know why I couldn't catch up in that moment, but rebooting my machine worked.
Old classic, power it on, power it off, get you through there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when you, I guess, would want to look at what your logs, right? And look at the time and see if you can find anything that makes sense as to why that happened.
Finally, an issue with the monitoring setup we went with. This was a systemd issue in Linux. In our monitoring setup, we had a service that monitors Solana and specifically your validator. You pointed at your validator. It spits the logs out into Grafana so that you can see what's going on and monitor your validator. And we could not get that to work. I had the bright idea that, oh man, I just got to change something in the Go code.
Oh yeah.
And you were like, that's dumb. Don't do that.
Well, I said, I'm not going to help you if you're going down that road. I absolutely refuse to do anything involving changing the things, the things that are literally there to serve that they work.
Yes, they do.
You got to trust that shit.
Yes. So we were able to fix it because basically we discovered that the systemd service that we were running was not able to figure out where it was supposed to run, like where it was supposed to pull the configuration file to help it run. That path was not established, even though it looked like from what was there, it was decidedly not. So we fixed that. Is that
that was
summarization?
Yeah, we fixed it. Well, we actually fixed that one in a way I usually don't. I remember we were looking up the like definitions of various variables that you can put into a Linux service, like a service file. That actually helped for once. The lore played into the plot of what was going on, which was great because it was great. It was just that was a satisfying fix because it was really annoying. And it was some incomplete documentation.
Now, if you're still with us, let's bring it back to troubleshooting. If you've made it this far into what is admittedly an incredibly niche podcast, either you've forgotten you turned it on and have wandered off into some other part of your home, or you've got what it takes to run a Solana validator. What it takes is curiosity and the love, or at least the sadistic urge, to problem solve. I asked all my interviewees the same question, to tell me about a recent problem they dealt with and how they dealt with it. I wanted to hear this less so because it sounds like a McKinsey interview question, and more because it shows even folks at the highest level are dealing with this every day. It's also fun to hear curious people light up when they speak. The common thread was that it's always super simple in retrospect.
Yeah, I saw that question and there's just so many things I could think of and none of them feel quite perfect because some of them would seem so trivial after the fact. They seem hard when you're first faced with them and after like, oh, that was obvious.
But that, and I know this is a little cheesy, what you learn along the way is where the growth is.
Knowing how it works is truly like the most beneficial thing you can do because just you got to work through it, problem solving to learn a couple of things and have faith in what you're doing. But that alone, that right there for me was not only one of the biggest turning points for me just with learning this stuff, it was a big turning point just in life because it was just wild that I was able to do that.
So now our validator is set up. Next time, we'll have a frank conversation about what it takes to get in the black. We'll be talking to stake pools, some larger holders, and see how our validator is looking several weeks in. Before we go, a little postscript. I had long talks with all of my guests, and in the interest of time, I was pretty judicious with my edits to try and make this thing concise. So I want to thank Garret Koehler of Assemble Sound, Megan Lund from Inflect, Daniel Huang from Stakefish, Tim Garcia from the Solana Foundation, Michael from Laine, Shinobi Systems, and my partner Derek for talking to me. I may end up airing larger chunks of these conversations as bonus content because there really was some informative stuff that got left on the cutting room floor. So stay tuned for that. Anyways, thanks for listening. This has been Validator Roadmap. Till next time.